And hello there. Welcome. Thank you for joining me as I begin my examination of the works of Amy Orr-Ewing with a series that will be examining two books by that author. The first book that we're going to examine beginning in this video is titled Is the Bible Intolerant? And in this video we'll be covering chapters 1 and 2 of the book. In the first few minutes here I'm going to introduce you to the author of the book and also sort of reintroduce the concept of what these An Atheist Read series are here for and what my intentions are with them and what I hope to accomplish. So if this is not the first time that you have seen me do this and you just want to skip straight to me reviewing the book material, then you can seek ahead in the video to the time code at the bottom of the video and you'll just jump right into it. So go for it if that's your thing. Are they gone? Okay, good. So for those of you who have not watched me do this before, if this is your first An Atheist Read series, the idea behind this is that I'm going to be reviewing a work of Christian apologetics from my perspective as an atheist in the hopes of answering the arguments and countering the claims that are made in the book. And the reason that I do that is because I think that it really helps for us to formulate our own thinking about things if we hear what other people think about them. This series is aimed at non-believers, atheists, agnostics, what have you, who have had books like this, or like The Case for Christ, or God's Not Dead, or The Magic Man in the Sky, or Mere Christianity, or many of the other apologetics books that I have reviewed in this fashion. If you've ever had one of these books handed to you by someone who was a friend or a relative who knew that you were a non-believer and said, well, maybe this will answer some of your questions. And you've read the book or paged through it and you just knew that you didn't agree with it, but you couldn't quite figure out why. You couldn't quite articulate what your response was or what your argument against what the book was saying was. If you have been in that situation, I have found in times when I was in that situation that it really helps to hear what other folks have to say. It helps to formulate my own thinking when I hear what other people think about it. So this is my way of sharing my own thinking with you, the viewer. And hopefully my answers to these questions, my responses to these arguments, my attempts to counter these claims will be of some use to you if you are an atheist watching this and you're working on formulating your own arguments in response to the sorts of arguments that are made by Christian apologists in books like this and the other ones that I have reviewed. This is actually the 21st An Atheist Read series. It's the 21st time that I have looked at a work or a pair of works of Christian apologetics and attempted to do this. So if this is your first time joining me, thank you very much. I'm very glad to have you aboard. I hope that you'll find some use out of this. I hope that it will help you to sort of clarify and focus your own thinking about these issues. And I hope that it will also help you in learning what Christian apologists have to say about these issues, what arguments that Christians make in defense of their own faith. So if you ever find yourself in conversations with Christians, you have a little bit of an idea of what to expect, and maybe you know where they're getting some of their ideas from. I find it helps tremendously if you want to have understanding between people and you want to have productive conversations with people who have a very different worldview than yours. If you're able to, first of all, have a respectful conversation that is carried on in good faith. That's very important. And once you have that, to be able to understand where the other person is coming from and to understand the arguments for their position and the arguments against your own position. I think that's very important. So that's another service that hopefully in some limited way this series and the others like them that I have done can perform. It can help to reveal and elucidate and help you to understand the arguments against the atheist position, or at least my position as an atheist, because as always, this is meant to be my response as an atheist to this material, not the definitive end-all, be-all, ultimate atheist response. If you are an atheist and you watch this and you have a different idea or you disagree with me about something or you think that I got something wrong, I invite you to respond to what I've had to say in the comments, and I'll repeat that invitation at the end of the video. But enough rambling about what this is all about. This series will be devoted to two books written by Amy Orr-Ewing Orr-Ewing, and she is the EMEA, or Europe, Middle East, and Africa Director for Ravi Zacharias Ministries International. She is also the Director of Programs for the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics, and along with her husband, she is the co-founder of Latimer Minster, which is an Anglican church in Beaconsfield, Buckinghamshire, England. She is the author of numerous articles on Christianity and apologetics, and she is the author of 2 books, both of which will be reviewed in this series. The first was published in the UK, originally under the title Why Trust the Bible, and it was subsequently published here in the US under the title Is the Bible Intolerant? That is the first book that we will begin examining in this video. And that book was quite successful, and it was shortlisted for the UK Christian Book Awards, for whatever that's worth. The second book was published originally in the UK under the title But Is It Real? And it was later published in the US as Is Believing in God Irrational? And we'll get to that book about halfway through this series. Now, like the series that I did a few years ago examining the works of Ray Comfort, where I looked at multiple books by Ray, this series will be looking at both of the aforementioned books. There will be a total of 8 videos in this series, and each video will cover 2 or 3 chapters from the book. The first 4 videos will be devoted to looking at Is the Bible Intolerant? And I will be using the American titles for the books. And the last 4 episodes of the series will be devoted to looking at the book Is Believing in God Irrational? So it's going to be divided evenly between the 2 books. First half, first book, second half, second book, 8 videos in total. So let's get started. Welcome people who skipped ahead with chapter 1 of the first book that we will be examining. That book, again, is the Bible Intolerant? And the chapter is titled, Isn't It All a Matter of Interpretation? And each chapter of the book is devoted and titled for a question about the Bible, which Amy Orr-Ewing says she commonly encounters. And for this first chapter, it is about biblical interpretation and the importance of that in forming one's opinion about the Bible and about Christianity. And she starts off the issue of biblical interpretation with this, quote, "The big issue behind the increasing numbers of questions about meaning and interpretation is the question of whether words and texts can have any inherent meaning at all. Does it all just come down to a matter of opinion? Is every interpretation equally valid? Can this text actually speak to me, or do I make it mean what I want?" Amy Orr-Ewing then shares an anecdote about her husband, who is a vicar and who, as I mentioned in the introduction, for those of you who watched that bit, is a co-founder of a church along with her. And this is a story of when her husband, the vicar, was at a wedding, and he was speaking to a woman at the wedding who explained to him that she wasn't a Christian. And the reason that she wasn't a Christian was that she didn't believe that words could have ultimate meanings, that words only had the meanings that were imparted to them by the people who were reading or hearing them. And since there is no ultimate meaning, it makes no sense to say that the Bible is the absolute Word of God, because even the words of the Bible cannot have ultimate meanings. Orr-Ewing's husband replied that if that's true and words have no ultimate meaning, then why wouldn't it be fair of him to interpret the woman's statement that she wasn't a Christian to mean that she was a Christian? Well, in choosing this example to illustrate the issue of text interpretation, Orr-Ewing is setting up a bit of a straw man. In her story, the woman at the wedding says that because words have no ultimate meaning, the Bible can mean anything she wants it to mean. And it's that statement that Orr-Ewing's husband is seeking to invalidate by asking if "I'm not a Christian" could be interpreted to mean "I'm a Christian." But regardless of the opinion of the woman at the wedding, most people who argue that the Bible is open to interpretation and that no single interpretation should be considered correct to the exclusion of all others aren't saying that the Bible or any other text can mean anything. Instead, they're arguing that there is a range of interpretations and that in most cases it is difficult, if not impossible, to choose one single interpretation that is absolutely correct to the exclusion of all competing interpretations. Orr-Ewing explores the question of why people believe that when it comes to the Bible, interpretation is everything. Unsurprisingly, to anyone who has studied Christian apologetics before, Orr-Ewing chalks up this belief to the prevalence of one of the favorite boogeymen of apologetics, and it's one that we heard a great deal about in just the previous series, and that is, of course, the dreaded postmodernism. Remember how much Nancy Pearcey hated postmodernism in the previous series? For those of you who have been with me for a series prior to this one, something tells me that Amy Orr-Ewing isn't going to love postmodernism so much either. She writes of how influential Ludwig Wittgenstein was in this area, how he viewed language as being entirely dependent on context. Context determines interpretation. And this means that absolute truth claims, like those made about the Bible, are meaningless. Orr-Ewing objects to this, since it means that any framework intended to provide universal meaning must necessarily be discarded. And she can't be on board with that because she is arguing in favor of just such a universal framework, namely Christianity. Well, she also employs a version of the Roadrunner tactic, which some of you may remember from way back when I reviewed the book by Norman Geisler and Frank Turek, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, where they introduced the Roadrunner tactic, and it was also referred to in the previous series about Nancy Pearcey's book as the argument from self-referential absurdity. That's basically where if you can show that an argument collapses under its own premises, or that an argument cannot be applied to itself without contradicting itself, then therefore the argument is invalid. Orr-Ewing imposes that argument or that form of argumentation on this view about language by saying that denying the validity of universal worldviews would also have to apply to the view that there are no valid universal worldviews. And actually, paradoxes like that, where we find that it's very difficult to express a complex idea without appearing to contradict the very idea we're trying to express, are one reason why modern thinkers have come to regard language as only capable of expressing truths that are limited and contextual rather than absolute and universal. According to Michel Foucault, power plays a key role in determining the meaning of words. Institutionalized languages are not merely structures of communication, but structures of power that tell the users of that language what the words mean. And to insist that words have objective meanings is to assert power over others. And Amy Orr-Ewing says, quote, "This would mean that when we come to read the Bible, we must be suspicious of the writers who are exercising power over us, and even more suspicious of anyone who might try to help us interpret the Bible. Any attempt at preaching from or explaining the Bible is purely a sinister attempt to gain power over another." Well, I wouldn't say purely, but perhaps partially. I think Orr-Ewing is misunderstanding the role that power plays in this theory of language. It's not that we all knowingly, willfully use language to exercise power over each other every time we use it. It's not intentional. It's not a conscious effort to dominate others by forcing them against their wills to concede that words mean what we say they mean. Rather, it's an unconscious and unavoidable aspect of how language works. When I speak these words that I'm speaking right now, I need you to agree with me on what those words mean. I need to insist that you think these words mean the same things that I think they mean in order for us to communicate. In order to make myself understood, I have to disregard your right to interpret my words differently than I'm interpreting them, at least on a literal level, because there will always be the possibility of unintended implications to something I say whenever I or anyone else says anything. We never have full control of our words and how our words are received, because the message that we intend to send is only effective if the message that our audience receives is the same one that we intend to send. And in most cases, people from the same culture who speak to each other in the same language will have a common understanding of the meaning of the words they say. But if there is a misunderstanding or a disagreement over what the speaker is trying to communicate, the speaker's assertion of power still comes into play. It's not that the speaker is being a bully necessarily. It's just the way language works. If you want to communicate something to someone else, or if I want to communicate something to you, I need to get you to accept my intended meaning for the things I'm saying, or else it will be a completely fruitless exercise. Well, next, Orr-Ewing takes issue with the ramifications of God's non-existence to language. What would language be like if God did not exist? Well, if God doesn't exist, she says, then there is no transcendent authority to determine what words mean, and therefore words can mean anything. Unless God exists, she writes, language cannot carry meaning. To reject God is to undermine language. And she says, quote, if no such transcendental signified exists, the meaning of words arise out of their relationship with an immediate context and not out of something more fixed and absolute. This would make language completely self-referential. Imagine how frustrating it would be if you had a sister or brother who insisted on interpreting your words to them as they pleased, with no reference to any fixed meaning for the given words. Well, there's a couple of points here. First, the existence of God wouldn't change the way language works at all. It wouldn't matter if God decreed from on high that the word ink pen refers to this and the word wristwatch referred to this. Because if myself and another person agreed between ourselves that actually ink pen meant this and wristwatch meant this, then that's what those words would mean in that context to us, because that's the way we agreed to have it. There's nothing that God could do about it, short of altering our thoughts to force us to interpret language according to his wishes. But I think it's fairly obvious that God, if he exists, is either unable or unwilling to do that. Second, the lack of fixed and absolute meanings for words doesn't mean that we are just at liberty to interpret someone else's words any way we please. I mean, in a sense, we are. We can decide privately that any word means anything that we want it to mean. No one's going to stop us from doing that. But if we want language to be useful as a tool for communication and for self-expression, we need to seek a meeting of the minds. We need to agree on the meanings of words, or at least be aware of each other's intended meanings. We don't think that this is an ink pen and that this is a wristwatch because those are fixed and absolute meanings of those words. We think it because we, the speakers of the English language, have implicitly agreed with each other that those words signify those objects. If for some reason the usage of those words were to change, and in, say, 100 years, most people called this a wristwatch and this a pen, then that's what those words would mean. This would be a wristwatch. It doesn't mean that this would transform into this. It means that wristwatch would be the word that signifies this, and that's just what it would mean. And if someone from our era took a time machine 100 years into the future and heard people calling one of these a wristwatch, they could insist all they wanted that this wasn't a wristwatch, that this was actually an ink pen, but if everyone else called it a wristwatch, they would just be wasting their breath, because language doesn't operate according to fixed absolute definitions of words. It operates according to widely shared agreement on the definition of words among the speakers of the language. And that agreement and that mutual desire to understand and to be understood is all that is necessary for language to work. You don't need fixed and absolute meaning. You just need understanding between the parties involved in the conversation as to what the words mean. Fixed and absolute meaning is not necessary. And I would even argue that it would be detrimental to language, because then you wouldn't have as much potential for language to grow and evolve and change with the needs of the people who use it. Well, Orr-Ewing takes an all or nothing approach to meaning. Either words have absolute fixed meanings or they have no meanings at all, and it's absolute chaos. So let's say that we're willing to accept that Orr-Ewing's version of meaning is possible. How do we go about reading the Bible in that case? She says, quote, one starting place could be the author. Probably the most important questions to ask about an author are to do with their intention in writing. When we come to look at the New Testament and the Gospels in particular, two of the Gospel writers let us know what their intentions are. And the two Gospel writers to whom she refers are Luke, who writes at the start of his Gospel that he intends to write, quote, an orderly account of the events of the life of Jesus based on his own careful investigations, and John, who tells us in his Gospel that he has written so that those who will read will believe in Jesus as the Son of God and will have eternal life through him. So those two authors tell us explicitly what they intend to accomplish, what their purpose is in writing the Gospels. But, Orr-Ewing adds, we don't have to accept the stated intentions of those Gospel authors at face value. We can postulate possible motives behind their writing for ourselves. For instance, perhaps their stated intentions were genuine, but they were unknowingly passing on false information. Or perhaps they were being deceptive and they were knowingly passing along false information as though it were the truth, hoping that the readers would believe them. Or perhaps the author's motives were genuine and they wrote what was also largely true to the facts, and therefore we should accept them more or less at face value. And those are the only three possibilities that Orr-Ewing entertains. There's also the possibility, which she doesn't consider, that the texts we have today were not written by Luke or John at all, and are each the products of multiple authors, which may have been motivated by combinations of all of those three possibilities, as well as others that weren't even mentioned. It's possible for the Gospels to be the result of people sincerely telling what they thought to be the truth, and people knowingly trying to pass false information, and people embellishing a pre-existing story with some details they'd heard perhaps from another source, and people choosing to focus on a particular facet of the story for their own artistic or political reasons, and who knows how many other motives could have been involved in producing what we now see today as the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And let's not forget two more very important factors. The texts that we have today were written nearly 2,000 years ago, and most of us, those of us who are not Bible scholars, who can read in the original Koine Greek or Aramaic or the other original languages in which the Bible was written, we are reading modern or relatively modern translations of those 2,000 or nearly 2,000-year-old texts. And in order to ascertain the original intentions of the authors, even just generally speaking, with any reasonable degree of certainty, we'd need to know a lot more about the specific social, cultural, and political context in which the authors were writing than we actually do. Otherwise, we might overlook things that would have been obvious to most readers at the time. Have you ever watched a TV show, like a comedy series, a sitcom from the 1950s? Or better yet, have you ever listened to a radio show from the 30s or the 40s? And there's a joke that just absolutely kills with the live audience that was there at the time the show was recorded. They just roll in the aisles at how funny this line is. But it's not funny to you at all. And maybe not only is it not funny, but you don't even understand why it was supposed to be funny. It's just completely lost on you. Well, the reason for that is because you and that audience from 60 or 70 years ago are occupying social and cultural spaces that, though they share a great deal in common, are also very different from each other. People back then got the joke because it occurred within their context. In another century or two, were it not for the presence of the laughing audience to act as a cue, people might not even be able to tell that a given line from that 1930s radio drama was even meant as a joke, because the cultural context will have changed so much in the meantime. Context is so essential to interpretation. If you don't know what the context in which the original material was written, then it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to properly interpret the text in light of the author's original intentions. And something similar to my radio show story happens when we try to figure out what the original intentions of the authors of the Bible were. We can learn a great deal from simply studying the text itself, but we also need to be able to refer to the context in which the text was written and originally read. And if we can't do that, then we'll have no hope of determining what the author originally intended when they wrote it. And unfortunately, those of us living today in 2017 are so far removed from the context in which the Gospels were written that our very best reconstruction of that context isn't going to be much more than an educated and largely incomplete guess. Well, Orr-Ewing seems to miss this crucial point entirely. She writes that when testing the text to determine the original intentions of the authors, we can employ inductive and deductive methods. And she says, quote, "Inductive questions would ask whether the text of a gospel makes sense of the world external to it. Could the reader make connections between what is in the text and the real world all around us?" And that is the wrong question. If we want to learn what the author's original intentions were, then we don't need to make connections between what's in the text and the world all around us. We need to be able to make connections between the text and the world that was around the author and the original intended audience. It's those differences between us and that original intended audience that are so crucial to forming that accurate understanding and that accurate interpretation of the author's intentions. We don't focus on the things that we can find in common. We focus on those things we don't have in common because that's the space that needs to be closed. But we'll get more into that and more into how much we can know about that original context when we very shortly begin to look at chapter 2. Before we get there, let's wrap up chapter 1. Orr-Ewing finally comes to the role of the reader, and she says that it is the reader's responsibility to determine what an author's intended meaning is in a text. And she says, quote, "I would argue that to assert dogmatically that it is impossible for any text to have and communicate meaning is to be close-minded. The Christian does not ask a skeptic to naively accept what the Bible says because we say so, but only to be open-minded enough to read a gospel and ask questions of it, to scrutinize it and see for themselves whether or not what they find is compelling and truthful." Well, I'm very glad to see her say that, because questioning, scrutinizing, and coming to my own conclusions about the Bible is exactly what I did on my way to becoming an atheist. One last time, no one is seriously asserting that texts cannot have or communicate any meaning or meaning in any sense. The disagreement is over the existence of fixed, absolute meaning and over whether or not any meaning short of that should count as real meaning. Modern linguistic theories present language as fluid, evolving, and dependent upon shared understanding, not fixed absolute meaning. Apologists like Orr-Ewing are absolutists, who insist that if there is no ultimate transcendent meaning, then there is no meaning at all. But that's not how meaning works, and that's not how language works. Moving on now to chapter 2, which is titled, "Can We Know Anything About History?" Orr-Ewing begins by observing that today it's unfashionable in many circles to defend the notion of truth, including historical truth. The prevailing opinion in, and she says, quote, "our universities," and that's a very, very familiar phrase to anyone who reads apologetics. They're constantly going on about the shortcomings and the terrible things to be found in our universities. She says that the prevailing opinion in our universities today is that the quest for historical truth is a waste of time because such a thing doesn't exist, or is at least inaccessible to us. Because once again, she is establishing historical truth to mean something from history which we can know for certain, for absolute certain. And no one is saying that we can't learn things about history, or that studying history and trying to reconstruct what happened in the past isn't a worthwhile pursuit or is a complete waste of time. But let's be mindful of our limitations in doing that. And let's acknowledge that we can't know everything, that our picture of the past will always be incomplete. And for the most part, the further back into the past we go, the less accessible those historical truths will be, the more incomplete the picture that we make of that past era will be. And any investigation into the past will necessarily be informed and influenced by our position here in the present. These, to me, are all common sense things to keep in mind when studying history. to try to find the most complete and accurate picture of history that you can, that is as influenced as little as possible by our modern sensibilities and by our modern biases and our personal biases and prejudices. If you're not aware that you have those things, and you're not aware or willing to acknowledge that those things can influence your studies and your investigation and your conclusions, then you're not going to be able to account for them and try to mitigate their effects as much as possible. And your study of history is going to actually wind up far less accurate and less useful than it would be if you acknowledge the existence of these factors and try to work with them so that they wouldn't influence the outcome of your studies so much. It's just, if you care about reconstructing an accurate picture of how people lived long, long ago, if you care about discovering historical truths, then you need to acknowledge all of these limitations and all of these influencing factors and corrupting factors in order to deal with them so that your end result is as good as it can possibly be. And none of that means that studying history is a waste of time. It just means that there's a certain amount that we'll just never know. And if we want to have the best understanding, we need to be aware of that uncertainty and of the incomplete nature of our knowledge and all of those other factors that I just talked about. Well, Orr-Ewing writes about a time a few years ago when she spent a week at Cambridge fielding questions about Christianity from university students. And she writes, quote, "On the first evening, I was taken to the college bar to meet some people, and a guy came up to me to start a conversation. His opening line was, 'I hear that you are here to evangelize us. I think Christianity is a load of 4 asterisks. And I cannot believe that you are here to try and tell us about it.'" Isn't that how students talk? Is that really how students talk in English college bars? I've never been to an English college bar, so it's possible that they say things exactly like that. Anyway, the story continues. The student asks Orr-Ewing why she is a Christian, and she answers that Christianity stands up to scrutiny and is true in her experience. And the student isn't really interested in the experience bit. He doesn't really buy stories about the personal experience of God, but he is interested in the notion that Christianity is, as Orr-Ewing put it, intellectually robust. And so they talk about that. She says, quote, "We went on to talk about some of the reasons for belief in God and some of the evidence around the person of Christ. It was during that conversation that I found this question of history being raised very powerfully. As the compelling evidence for the historicity of Christ, his cross, and his resurrection was laid out, the best defense available to my new friend was to deny the possibility of knowing any history at all." Well, that might be because your new friend was a university student at a bar, and therefore not the ideal foil for a serious conversation about the historicity of Christianity. Because I'm here to tell you, it's entirely possible to be unconvinced by the so-called historical evidence for Christianity without chucking the entire field of history out the window. Of course, the main reason for that is that there is no historical evidence to corroborate anything but the most general, mundane aspects of the story of Jesus as found in the Gospels. But I bet we're coming to that. Okay, so before we get there, Orr-Ewing proceeds on the premise that the only way to refute the historical case for Christianity is to do away with the whole concept of being able to know anything about history. And she says that this rejection of historical certainty is a result of the overall skepticism that society now shows any form of certainty. She says, quote, "It is hardly surprising, then, that many people are incredulous that Christians, even those who seem to be quite intelligent, believe that the Bible records historical truth about the person of Christ and many other things. How can we be so sure? Surely all historical literature, including biblical histories like the Gospels, must be inherently suspicious." Do you like how she tries to sneak the Gospels into the category of historical literature there without anyone noticing? She says, "Oh, so does this mean we must be skeptical of the historicity of all historical literature, like the histories of Herodotus, the writings of Caesar, the Gospels, and so on?" I caught you. I saw it. I saw what you did. I've used this example a few times before in past series, but it's been a while, so if you've heard it before, I beg your indulgence. I just find it interesting how Christian apologists will insist that we treat the Gospels as reliable historical documents, and yet they apply very different standards to the scriptures of other religions, even far more recent and relatively modern ones like the Church of Latter-day Saints and its scripture, the Book of Mormon. Because the supposedly miraculous circumstances surrounding the composition of the Book of Mormon were corroborated by witnesses who put their names to their testimony. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about here, this is a copy of the Book of Mormon that I have here on my Kindle. And at the beginning of every edition of the Book of Mormon, there are two testimonies printed. There's the testimony of the three witnesses, and their names are Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, and Martin Harris. And right after that is the testimony of the 8 witnesses, and they are Christian Whitmer, Jacob Whitmer, Peter Whitmer, John Whitmer, Hiram Page, Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith, and Samuel H. Smith. We know their names because they put their names to their testimony. And those two groups, the 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses, signed statements claiming that they saw or handled the actual golden plates from which the Book of Mormon was supposedly translated, the plates that Joseph Smith claimed an angel had brought to him, had shown him where to look for and allowed him to find. They claimed that they had heard the voice of God, testifying that Smith's translation of the plates was due to the power of God. I think the 3 witnesses claimed to have actually seen the angel, and not one of them ever recanted that testimony, even after many of them broke off from the church in years following that. They had falling outs with Joseph Smith. They never recanted their testimony, and we still have their names to this very day. And you show me a Christian apologist who wouldn't crow nonstop in the face of every non-believer from now until kingdom come if there was such evidence for the Gospels. There is no comparison. And yet most Christians who are absolutely certain of the historical reliability of the 2,000-year-old anonymously authored, anonymously edited, largely uncorroborated Gospels are completely unimpressed by the signed eyewitness testimony corroborating the miraculous origin of the Book of Mormon. I wonder why that is. No, I don't believe that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon using magic seer stones from golden plates that were shown to him by an angel either, but that's not the point. The point is, if your threshold for what counts as persuasive evidence for the historical truth of a religious text is low enough that the Gospels make it across, then the Book of Mormon should make it over without missing a step. And yet, for Christians like Amy Orr-Ewing, it doesn't. So, does it make sense to regard history as unknowable? And what implications would this view of history have for the study of more recent history? Quote, you're going to love this. A historical event which, in my experience, helps bring this question into sharp focus for us is the Holocaust. In fact, the serious consequences of this idea that we cannot know what has happened in history are sharply underlined for us by the fact that it has opened the door to the Holocaust denial movement. It is, of course, ironic that with any mention of Holocaust denial, a discussion of historical relativism is usually dropped, but the truth is that within this highly publicized genre, revisionist scholars are even calling recent history into question. So if you're skeptical of the notion that we can know things about historical events, particularly from the fairly distant past, for certain, you're really only a few steps away from being a Holocaust denier. Right? Have I got that right? Sounds reasonable. Okay, just one problem. Holocaust deniers, and I've seen more than my share of them. I made a video about Holocaust denial nearly 4 years ago, and I'm still deleting their comments almost on a daily basis. Holocaust deniers don't usually deny the Holocaust on the basis of history being unknowable. They deny the validity of specific facts or specific portions of a given narrative. They don't say, well, how can we be sure the Holocaust happened when we can't be sure of anything? They just don't say that, at least not in any significant numbers. Discussions of historical relativism don't often occur regarding Holocaust denial because most Holocaust denial isn't rooted in historical relativism. It's rooted in historical ignorance, and there is a difference. And by the way, is there such a thing as a Christian apologist who won't tastelessly appeal to the fucking Holocaust in an attempt to make their shitty case for the truth of their pet myth? You know, just once, I'd love to see two apologists at a conference or something, and one of them starts to talk about the Holocaust, and the other one goes, "Oh, no, hey, come on, we don't need to bring the Holocaust into this, do we, for Christ's sake?" I mean, they probably wouldn't say that last bit, but you know what I'm saying. Anyway, she says, quote, "All views of history are not equally valid. We need to be able to draw some distinctions between history and pseudo-history. There are some standards of verification, ways of matching up fact and interpretation, which are plausible and recognizable by most of us. We may reject the pure historical objectivity of the 19th century, but surely a realistic and balanced approach leads us to a via media between illogical nihilistic relativism and the steely optimism of pure objectivity." I agree. The thing is, that pragmatic and balanced approach leads, for many of us, to the conclusion that there is absolutely no reason to treat the Gospels as reliable historical sources. You don't need to deny the possibility of historical knowledge to reject the historicity of the Gospels. And most people who reject the historicity of the Gospels are not rejecting it on that basis. This, to me, is a great big straw man argument. And I feel like the only reason she put these first 2 chapters in the book was because she wanted to have the book structured around 10 questions rather than 8 questions. Because these first 2 questions are, to me, in my experience, completely irrelevant to actual conversations that people have. I don't know if I have ever met someone who was not a Christian who denied the truth of Christianity because of these postmodern reasons that she cites, and that apologists often cite and spend pages and pages and pages arguing against. I just don't see very many people in the real world basing their anti-Christian or anti-religious arguments on these premises. I just don't think it's that much of a problem. Well, anyway, Orr-Ewing says that one way we can come to some reasonably certain conclusions about what happened in history is by examining converging lines of evidence. And then she spends 3 pages describing the various lines of evidence that confirm the occurrence of the Holocaust, because she can't write about all the converging lines of evidence confirming the historicity of the Gospels because there aren't any. She tries to assert that there are converging lines of evidence for the truth of the Gospels by arguing that the Gospel of Luke is based on Luke's own investigations, where he, she assumes, examines multiple lines of evidence, consults eyewitness testimony, compiles information from various sources in order to reach his account of what happened during the life of Jesus. And she then expands this argument to include the other Gospels, all of which were written by people who were committed to writing with, as Orr-Ewing calls it, scrupulous accuracy, and each of which presumably represents a separate line of evidence. Except we don't have access to any primary sources on which Luke, or whoever wrote Luke's Gospel, because it almost certainly wasn't Luke, might have based that gospel upon. And we can't assume that Luke must have based his account on good information just because Luke himself tells us that's what he did in the opening chapter of the gospel itself. If we don't have the primary sources that Luke consulted, then we can't judge for ourselves whether or not Luke consulted good sources and did those sources justice when he wrote the gospel. And we know, as much as we can know something about this, that the 4 Gospels were almost certainly not written independently. That the Gospel of Mark came first and was a major source for Matthew and Luke, and that all 4 Gospels were subject to later editing and interpolation by people other than the original authors, which makes the suggestion that they ought to be treated as 4 separate independent lines of evidence difficult, if not impossible, to take seriously. But at the end of the chapter, Orr-Ewing admits that even if we accept the possibility that we can know something about history, we still might be skeptical about the historical reliability of the Gospels just based on their contents. And that will be the subject of the next chapter. And we will pick up with that chapter in the next video in this series. And in the next video, I will cover the next 3 chapters of this first book of Amy Orr-Ewing's that we will be examining, Is the Bible Intolerant? We will look at chapter 3, Are the Biblical Manuscripts Reliable? Chapter 4, Is the content of the manuscripts reliable? And chapter 5, what about the canon? That's an excellent question. What about the canon? Well, we will dive into those chapters in the next video in this series. I want to thank you all for watching this video. Those of you who are coming back as veteran and Atheist Reads viewers, thank you so much for returning to this with me. Those of you who are watching this for the first time, thank you for jumping on board. I hope you find this to be of use and of interest. As I said at the beginning, if you have anything to say about anything that I have had to say, anything that you want to highlight, that you think I got right, that you think I got wrong, agree, disagree, whatever, please do feel free to leave a comment on this video and respond to anything I have had to say. And I also want to remind you, if you enjoyed this, if you got something out of it, if you appreciate this work that I do, please do like this video, share it, subscribe to this channel if you're not subbed already, and also please do consider becoming a patron of this channel, supporting this channel through Patreon in order to allow me to continue doing this. The Patreon campaign is where I earn my living, and it enables me to continue to make these videos, and it also enables me to, like, pay bills and buy food and derive some kind of enrichment from this work that I do that is very important to me and that I'm gratified to see is very important to many of you. So if this is something that you're able to do and that you're interested in doing to support this channel and support these videos that I make, please consider going to patreon.com/Steve Shives and becoming a patron. And if you pledge at levels higher than $1 a month, if you pledge at $5 a month or $10 a month or higher, there are some really cool perks that you can take advantage of, including a perk related to this series. So go check it out for yourself, patreon.com/Steve Shives. Thank you for your support, no matter what form that support comes in. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.